Hi guys, welcome back to Music History with Miss Lindsay. Today we are joined by my dog Addison in the background, so hopefully she won't bother us too much. All too often in music history, we don't spend enough time talking about composers of color and specifically Black composers, so I want to make sure that we dedicate time to highlight these really important people. So this week I'm going to be telling you about a Black composer named Florence Price. Florence Price was born in 1887 in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was really clear from the very beginning that Florence was a very skilled musician. She played the piano and the organ, and she gave her first piano recital at age 4 and wrote her first piece of music at age 11. She was obviously very, very smart, and she actually graduated from high school at 14 years old. She then went on to go to the New England Conservatory of Music, which is located in Boston, Massachusetts. She actually had to pretend to be Mexican so that she could avoid some of the racism that was being dealt towards Black people. She graduated with honors, and in 1910, she went on to become the head of the music department at another university, Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. In 1912, Florence married a lawyer named Thomas Price. Together they moved back to Little Rock, Arkansas, where she was from. In the early 1900s, racism, like I said, was really, really terrible. At that time, Jim Crow laws were still in effect, so Black people couldn't go into the same places that white people could. They weren't allowed to have the same jobs. They weren't allowed to sit anywhere they wanted to on a bus. They weren't allowed to vote. There was a lynching near Thomas's office, and it frightened them badly enough that they decided to move to Chicago. They were a part of the time in history known as the Great Migration. And the Great Migration was when Black people were moving or fleeing north from southern states because of Jim Crow laws. In 1931, Florence and Thomas got divorced. So she was left with 2 daughters to take care of by herself. She ended up getting a roommate who was another Black woman composer named Margaret Bonds, and she was also extremely talented. In 1932, Florence and Margaret both entered a competition and won a lot of awards for their compositions. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra then went on to perform her Symphony No. 1, making her the first African American female composer to have a work played by a major orchestra. That is huge. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra is considered one of the best orchestras in the world, even to this day. Some of you have had the opportunity to go visit and see just the beautiful building that exists there. That hall has been played by some of the most famous and talented musicians in the world. And every time we go there, I just can't help but get goosebumps at the history that has taken place there. This is a perfect example. Florence Price, the first Black woman composer, had her piece played by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Here is a little bit of her Symphony No. 1. Florence Price combined a bunch of musical traditions in her compositions. She took some of the traditional classical music styles and combined it with African American church music. Composers and musicians like Scott Joplin were really popular, and you can hear the rhythms of ragtime in her music. Let me show you a little bit of Scott Joplin's music. And now here, listen to the third movement of her Symphony Number 1. They sound a lot alike, right? You can hear it in the rhythms, you can hear it in that dance quality, in that bounciness. It makes you want to groove. It's not your typical classical music that you would have heard at the time. Florence Price wrote a ton of music. She wrote string quartets. She wrote choral music for large choirs. She wrote piano solos, concertos, just tons of music. Like I said at the beginning, unfortunately, a lot of times in classical music, we don't really focus on composers or musicians of color. Part of that is for racist reasons. Back in times like when Florence Price lived, and even further back, 1800s, 1700s, there were Black composers. They were writing music, but unfortunately, because they weren't allowed to have their music played, they weren't allowed to perform that in public, a lot of that music has gotten lost or it never became popular. And so as people started to learn about music history, the music that endured was music by white composers. And now that we know better, it is our job to go back and look for that music because it does exist. Don't let anybody tell you that it doesn't exist. If I'm honest, I had never heard of Florence Price before I learned about her to share with you. And that is such a shame because as you can hear from these recordings, her music belongs in the same repertoire as Mozart, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Dvorak. She belongs in there. It is just as good. It is just as skillfully created, and she deserves the same recognition.